Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Money, 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 Beyond Philanthropy, What is the Role of Public Dollars? I'm Patty McElreevy, President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today's webinar is a special showcase of the 8th annual report, Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy 2020, Data to Drive Decisions. We will provide background on the project, describe the research methodology, lift up findings from this year's report, which covers the year 2019, and then discuss the differing roles of private and public dollars. This webinar is presented in partnership with Candid and is co-sponsored by Giving Compass, Interaction, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, Philanthropy California, Philanthropy New York, and the Funders Network. Some reminders before we get started. If you're on Twitter, please use hashtag SODP 2021 or hashtag CDP4Recovery. That's CDP number 4 recovery to share comments and join the discussion. We're recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. While you can access Zoom created captions today, we will have more accurate captions in the recording. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box, and we will answer them at the end of the panel presentation. At the end of the webinar, there will also be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings and to meet your needs. In the spirit of healing, I acknowledge and honor the original people of the land where I'm located and where CDP is headquartered, now referred to as Washington, D.C. For many generations, Washington, D.C. has been a meeting and exchange site that Indigenous communities have lived on and been connected to. This includes the Nashangtunk, Anacostan, Pamunkey, and Piscataway people. We honor their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. Despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Indigenous people are still here today, demonstrating innumerable talents and gifts amid continued oppression and colonialism. CDP recognizes the injustices that have been done to Indigenous people throughout the United States and elsewhere in the world. The work we're sharing with you today builds on a multi-year partnership between the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and Candid, one that taps into the respective strengths and expertise of each of our organizations. CDP's mission is to leverage the power of philanthropy to mobilize a full range of resources that strengthen the ability of communities to withstand disasters and recover equitably when they occur. CDP aims to increase the effectiveness of contributions given to disasters, to bring greater attention to the life cycle of disasters from preparedness and planning to relief, to rebuilding, recovery, and resilience efforts, and to provide relevant advice from experts with deep knowledge of disaster philanthropy. Candid was formed in 2019 when the Foundation Center and GuideStar joined forces to become one organization. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. Our partnership with Candid allows us to collect and share better data about disaster philanthropy so that funders will have knowledge and tools to be more effective in their disaster-related giving. Disasters, by definition, are generally unpredictable, so we tend not to think about them until they happen. Although not predictable, they do happen with regularity. At CDP, we have long believed that the scope, scale, and frequency of disasters will only intensify. We have witnessed this shift in 2021 with the recent spate of disasters, including fires across Europe and the Western US, floods across the world, large and small, and dozens of named Atlantic tropical storms, including Hurricane Ida. And of course, it's impossible to talk about disasters this year without mentioning the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019, the year this data set is based upon, there were $14 billion disasters in the US alone, costing over $48 billion. Disasters are becoming not only more frequent, but also increasingly expensive. Many of these disasters were not named tropical storms, but were fires, floods, tornadoes, and winter storms. Globally, there were 396 disasters that affected 95 million people and saw 11,755 deaths in 2019. Total economic losses were 103 billion across the globe. While disasters may shock us, they shouldn't surprise us. They will happen, and philanthropy will be called upon to respond. Given the inevitability of disasters, it is imperative for funders to make use of their dollars in the most effective way possible. In that spirit, our report and tools focus on 3 key questions. First, how did the funding community respond to disasters in 2019? What did they fund? How much funding did they provide overall? Second, How does the response of foundations fit into the larger landscape of disaster giving? How does foundation funding compare to other sources of funding, for example, such as corporate giving, bilateral, multilateral, and government assistance? Third, what can funders do to become more effective in terms of disaster-related funding? I'd like to now introduce Supriya Kumar, who is the Global Partnerships Research Manager at Candid. She supports the organization's quantitative and qualitative research and data-driven initiatives with the goal of advancing knowledge and practice in philanthropy.
Thank you, Patty. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So to examine some of these questions that Patty briefly discussed, we at Candid started the process 8 years ago, as Patty mentioned, by working with an expert technical committee to develop a project taxonomy that allows us to classify various types of disasters as well as assistance strategies. Tanya, I'm not sure if you're able to go to the next slide. Thank you. This year, we renamed the natural disaster category to actually state natural hazard and severe weather events. And this is to acknowledge that human activity has contributed to weather events. So in our taxonomy, disaster types, as you can see, can be classified as the following. Natural hazard and severe weather events include such things as floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and we also include epidemics in this category. We have man-made disasters, which include things like oil spills and building collapses, or complex humanitarian emergencies. This is things like the current situation in Ethiopia, or even the emerging events in the Belarus-Polish borders. In addition, we also have a fourth bucket that we include in our analysis, general disasters, which includes unspecified funding for disasters or multiple disparate disasters. We also examine disaster assistance strategies. These strategies cover the full life cycle of disasters, from resilience, risk reduction and mitigation, to preparedness, to response and relief, and reconstruction and recovery. As Patty mentioned, this is the 8th annual report we've published using this taxonomy as our guiding framework. For this year's report, we examined 2019 funding, and sources of data include information reported directly to Candid by funders through our electronic reporting program, as well as IRS returns for US-based foundations. Due to IRS processing delays because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the data for 2019 for institutional philanthropy is actually incomplete, and we're still collecting data. And that's why all of the institutional philanthropy in the report are presented as funding to date. Major disasters and humanitarian crises affected millions of people globally in 2019. So how did philanthropy respond? When we drew upon 12 data sources, we documented almost $30 billion in disaster-related giving in 2019. We specifically identified $352 million in funding by foundations and public charities for disasters based on Candid's database. This figure includes both transactions by US and non-US donors. Just over half of the funding by foundations, 55%, went to natural disasters. Interestingly, we did see funding for epidemics at the top. Of the 99 transactions we identified for funding for epidemics, 53 of them were for the Ebola virus. And we did see 32 transactions that were repurposed for COVID-19. 4% of funding was directed to complex humanitarian emergencies, such as the crisis in Yemen. 41% of support was for general disasters, and man-made accidents received less than 1%. With respect to assistance strategies, the largest proportion of foundation funding, 51%, went to response and relief efforts. Tanya, do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. 6% went toward reconstruction and recovery, 4% went towards resilience measures, and 17% went to preparedness. In the previous 7 years of our disaster analysis, preparedness averaged only 4% of disaster funding and never rose higher than 6%. So this is quite a large proportional increase for preparedness. In 2019, we saw 61% of grant dollars go to North America, 2% for Latin America and Mexico, 3% for the Caribbean, 7% for Asia, the Middle East and the Pacific, 14% for Africa, and 1% for Europe and Russia. Funding in 2019 remained focused in North America, but the slight increase in Africa was due to Ebola and Cyclone Idai funding. Responding to disasters is an enormous task that no single sector can accomplish on its own. Here's a quick rundown of what giving looked like from other funding sources in 2019, beginning with corporate giving. So according to survey data in the 2019 edition of the Giving in Numbers report, which is annually published by the chief executives for corporate purpose, 157 of the world's largest companies directed an estimate $150 million toward disaster relief in 2019. Although 70% of companies reported that disaster response was highly important, disaster relief actually experienced the greatest decrease in median cash giving from 2017 to 2019. And we saw since 2017, disaster relief cash has actually slowed, decreasing by 66% in 2019. Individuals often donate via donor advised funds or through online platforms and crowdfunding sites. We took a look at 2 donor advised funds and 2 online platforms for illustrative purposes. In 2019, Network for Good helped direct $11.3 million in donations for disasters through their giving portal, representing nearly 882,000 individual donations. But this is actually only 2% of the over $519 million that was contributed through their software platform in 2019. Global Giving raised $5.1 million for disasters, which supported 183 projects. The top funded disasters for Global Giving were Hurricane Dorian, flooding in South Asia, Cyclone Idai, and Hurricane Michael. Individuals are also increasingly using donor advised funds, such as those managed by Fidelity Charitable and Vanguard Charitable. Based on 2019 data, individuals gave $20.5 million through Fidelity and $6 million through Vanguard for disasters. By far, the largest flows of aid for disasters and humanitarian crises come from governments through bilateral aid to other countries. Official development assistance by 30 government members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Development Assistance Committee, OECD, totaled $22 billion for disasters in 2019. 61% of this was for complex humanitarian emergencies and 8% for natural hazards and weather events. Non-OECD DAC government donors and multilateral organizations contributed an additional $2.8 billion, with 78% going to complex humanitarian emergencies and 4% to natural hazards and weather events in 2019. When we look at the US, we see that FEMA, the US Federal Emergency Management Agency, distributed $3.2 billion in grants and assistance for domestic disasters in 2019. This is an $8 billion decrease from 2018. Of this money, FEMA distributed $1 billion for floods, $825 million for storms, and $746 million for wildfires. The top recipient locations were Nebraska, California, and Iowa. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, allocated $1 billion in 2019 to states and local governments to recover from 2017 disasters, which included Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, among other events. This is also a decrease of over $33.5 billion compared to last year. Grantees directed that money towards eligible disaster recovery activities, which includes housing rehabilitation, public improvements, and economic development. The U.S. Economic Development Administration, or EDA, invested approximately $381.7 million in 156 projects, and this was a $256.1 million increase from 2018. I believe this is the only data source we saw an increase in giving from the previous year. So when you put all of this together, the data from all the 12 sources we tracked, we can see that at least $30 billion in 2019 was directed towards disasters, with $352 million coming from institutional philanthropy. So I'm just going to show this quick breakdown so you can take a look at all the different sources I just covered before we move on to the next slide. Okay. So in terms of US Foundation trends, Candid and CDP has now tracked grant making for disasters for over 8 years And in order to actually identify what the trends look like, we compared a matched set of 324 foundations and looked at their disaster-related funding in 2019 and see how it compares pretty steadily to 2018, although we see that fewer grants were donated in 2019. We do this because as we collect data, and as I mentioned, our 2019 data is missing some grants. This is just a way to still see what the trends might look like when we look at a match set. And of course, the big elephant in the room is COVID-19. Again, we were focused on 2019 data when we were looking at this specific report. So this was before the coronavirus pandemic. But we know that this continues to be an issue that is top of mind for many funders. Candid has thus far tracked more than $26.4 billion in grants and pledges for COVID-19. In March, CDP and Candid released a report titled Philanthropy in COVID-19, Measuring 1 Year of Giving, which looked at trends connected to philanthropic grant making towards COVID. We will be releasing a follow-up report in 2022, and I just want to make a call out there that it's not too late to ensure that your funding data is included in that report. And in a few slides later on, we will share how you can share that information with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Patty. Please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A. I went through a lot of data, so feel free to add those in the chat. And Patty, I'll turn it over back to you.
Thanks, Supriya. I definitely have some questions I'm going to come back to you with because I feel there's definitely some challenges, and I've just given a moment to percolate as we think it through, because this analysis, it can be downloaded for free from the site disasterphilanthropy.candid.org. And the PDF report is complemented by the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy funding map that visualizes who's funding what and where, which can also be found on this site. And of course, put your questions for Supriya into the Q&A. We'll have a moment with her to get further into detail. So thank you. As you heard from Supriya, it's imperative that the larger network of government, private, corporate donors build partnerships that can help maximize and leverage limited dollars. The tools CDP and Candid have developed can help donors understand the funding landscape more fully, allowing them to identify opportunities to address funding gaps, increase collaboration, make more strategic decisions. We ask that you help us make these tools more robust. We invite foundations and corporate donors to share their data with us directly, which becomes even more important during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the challenges in reporting is that we often have limited data about what disaster assistance strategies are being employed. While sharing data, we invite funders to provide more precise descriptions on what is funded so that we can portray more adequately how donors are investing across the disaster life cycle. Additionally, our analysis relies on publicly available data. We know there's additional giving we are not accounting for, particularly from foundations outside the United States, smaller and regional foundations, and corporate giving. So spread the word. Let us know what we're missing and invite others to send us their information. The more information we have, the better equipped our tools will be to foster greater collaboration and coordination in the field, and thus hopefully help you in your own giving. Please contact Supriya. Her email is supriya.kumar@candid.org if you would like to add your data. We'll give that information again at the end. And I'd like to now take a moment to introduce Colin Ford from Pew Charitable Trust. Colin is a manager with Pew's Fiscal Federalism Initiative, leading the project's research into state and federal spending on natural disasters and other topics. He also engages stakeholders to improve understanding of the federal-state fiscal relationship and ensure that policymakers have data and evidence to inform their decision-making. So quite the job there, Colin. So Colin, I'm hoping you and I can reflect on the information shared and position it in the context of government funding, in both the domestic and international context. After 27 years working in the international humanitarian aid space, I know the importance of both philanthropic giving and public dollars. One of the most common misconceptions of government assistance is that its origins are within one agency for one specific purpose. For example, in a prior role, I used to regularly speak at the U.S. Agency for International Development Training for government officials involved in disaster response. The participants were from agencies as varied as the Department of Defense to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to the Centers for Disease Control, usually done the other way around for us, the Centers for Disease Control, and the Forest Service. So as an incredible assortment of skills, expectations, mechanisms for responding organizations to navigate within the international disaster realm. And as Supriya notes, especially complicated to track efficiently. So Colin, can you tell us more about the role of government spending in the US context?
Sure, and hopefully everybody can hear and see me. And thanks for having me, and thanks to Supriya for that presentation. So yeah, Patty, the role of government spending is really critical, and it's really complex, as you mentioned. So, in its simplest form, the way we pay for disasters in the US really involves all three levels of government, so federal, state, and local. So you can imagine when a disaster hits, that local government is the first line of defense, the first responders. States can step in with their resources as an event becomes more severe or costly or complex. And then finally, those federal partners step in when the capacity of both the state and locals are overwhelmed, and the governor or tribal leader requests presidential declaration. And that's the mechanism that allows a lot of the main federal disaster aid programs to flow into those state and local governments. And as you can imagine, the more levels of government involved in paying for something more complex and intertwined the funding flows become. To the point that you were just making, the additional layer of complexity there is the fact that even though we associate disaster spending with FEMA, to a lesser extent with HUD, and as Supriya was saying with EDA at Commerce, federal spending is actually spread across as many as 17 major departments and agencies at the federal level. And much of the spending that happens outside of FEMA. Some of the research we've done has highlighted that it's a similarly complex story at the state level across all the 50 states. So in Florida, for example, we found that at least 11 different departments and agencies at the state level were spending on disaster spending. So you can imagine it becomes a very complex system very quickly. And I'd add that it's a system that's starting to show some strain as the result of the more complex, severe, and frequent disaster events that we're seeing.
So let's pause on that last observation a moment. So disasters are more frequent, they're more expensive, they're more severe. With that rising frequency of disasters in mind, our governments, federal, state, local, all these complexities you spoke about, 17 here, 11 there, are they spending more? Yeah,
so it's a good question. And given exactly the complexity I described, it's really challenging to say precisely what's happening with that spending, which in a lot of ways is a missed opportunity. So the U.S. Government Accountability Office estimates that the federal government spent at least $460 billion on disaster assistance between 2005 and 2019. We've looked more closely at one of those programs, FEMA's Public Assistance Program, which is one of its biggest, and found a 23% increase in spending on that program if you compare the last 2 decades. But when it comes to the other levels of government that I mentioned, state and local, at present, it's too difficult to identify an upward trend because the data just isn't there. And our research has really focused on the state level and found that the reason for that is that most states don't comprehensively track their disaster spending across all of the agencies, like I mentioned, or across all of the activities, similar to the taxonomy that Supriya was talking about in her remarks. And from where we sit, that spending information is really important, and it needs to be better tracked in order to better define the problem that we're facing, hopefully manage some of that public spending that's happening, and to provide more evidence and urgency around the need to be prepared and the need to better manage long-term risk, better manage the long-term impacts of disasters by hopefully investing more resources in mitigation.
No, thank you. I mean, I think it's interesting. We're seeing similar upticks in numbers as well across the international system. I mean, this is, the larger scale, the more disasters, the more funding, the greater the appeals that are happening. There was a $3 billion increase in funding, from 2018 to 2019 on the international side. So regretfully, though, those appeals are unmet. The unmet requirements also increase. So even though the numbers go up, the actual, accommodation of those numbers is not necessarily forthcoming. So with the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, closed out last week. There's calls for urgent action alongside the multiple alarm bells that's still ringing in our ears. And we can't help but wonder how much worse it may get, especially if countries continue to tighten their belts on foreign aid while also shifting more to domestic spending. The Sustainable Development Goals adopted by all United Nations member states, including the United States, provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people on the planet now and into the future. One of these core tenets is to leave no one behind. Colin, what are some of the tensions that you've observed regarding the roles of different levels of government? And what recommendations would you propose? Because if we're really serious about leaving no one behind, we have to figure some of this out. We can't leave people behind because of bureaucracy or mandate battles. I mean, what are some suggestions you have there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the thing that I would point out is that the rising spending at the federal level that I pointed out, hasn't gone unnoticed by federal policymakers. And that's really led to a long-term discussion that's traversed, multiple presidential administrations. We've heard it from Congress, we've heard it from watchdog groups about the need to manage rising federal disaster spending. And you can kind of bucket the policy approaches that have come out of that conversation into two categories. The first being, raising the threshold at which states become eligible to receive federal funds. So in effect, making it harder to get that disaster declaration, and having state and local governments and others, for example, philanthropy, shouldering more of the costs of particularly those smaller cost disasters. The other category is, and I alluded to this, incentivizing mitigation. So those activities that can reduce the overall impact of disasters into the future and hopefully bend the cost curve. So I think baked into both of those approaches is the idea that state and local governments should be doing more, whether that's to pay more for those lower costs, but still, costly disasters, or to invest their own funds in their own communities towards mitigation. And that's part of the reason, that we think it's so important for policymakers at those levels to be able to track and account for what they're spending on those things, similar to the types of tracking and accounting that Candid has done in the philanthropic world. So I would only add that more recently we've seen a shift at the federal level towards more federal direct investment in mitigation and resilience, things like the recent infrastructure bill, FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, some eligible funding in the American Rescue Plan Act. So we do see that strong message from the federal government, about investing in mitigation using federal funds. But I like to point out that much of that is one-time funding and does not necessarily address the underlying challenges of who pays for what in this changing landscape of more frequent and severe and costly disasters.
And even though that signal is coming from the federal government, it was originally a $3 trillion budget that they were requesting. So even though they're sending those signals, they're not necessarily getting what they're indicating. Their appeal is also not being funded, right? So in a certain way, we're seeing that deficiency track even in the places where there is that willingness to send the signals. And the challenges, that you're presenting are very similar to those that play out within the international response system. These combating roles and responsibilities, a lack of consistency in data collection and transparency. Sometimes it's not a lack of willingness to give data, it's just that they're collecting the data in different ways. And, poor Candid has to try and figure out how to match those up. And as we said earlier, we don't know what's really disaster, what's what for what phase in the disaster. So what can policymakers do to address that challenge?
Yeah, this is why I love, speaking with these organizations, because some of the challenges that we think about are so similar. So the biggest thing really is to know more about what we're spending. And what we always say is, you can't manage what you don't track. So at the federal level, there has been discussion about legislation that would create more comprehensive reporting and would pull together more of the spending that's happening at those disparate agencies into one place, so it'd be easier to track and easier for people to assess and for policymakers to use to inform their decisions. At the state level, we have seen some states start to implement better tracking of their disaster spending in the wake of some of the research that we did. So for example, In Ohio, they came up with a system to start tracking state agency spending as soon as their emergency operations center comes online every time a disaster strikes. We heard from them that that was actually helpful then when COVID hit, because they already had that system in place to start tracking that spending. Different approaches in other states include just better reporting back to the legislature about where disaster spending using those state-owned funds is going. That's something we've seen in North Carolina and Virginia. But beyond tracking spending, I think the biggest thing to harp on again is keeping mitigation at the forefront of the discussion and as kind of the end goal. Because like I said, that's the way you bend the cost curve over time. And we know, from research by the National Institute of Building Sciences that we often hear that, every dollar invested in mitigation can save $6 in recovery and response costs. And so I think, the role of, governments in really starting to track this spending and figuring out where their resources could be, more strategically or more forward-thinking made investments that they could be really, sorry, I just completely lost my thread there, but I will end it there with saying, you can't mitigate what you don't track. So that's one of the most important things that policymakers and others can do. But I do want to kind of turn it around, Patty, because the U.S. government spending is just a piece of the puzzle, and I do want to hear more from you about beyond policymakers, the role that philanthropy can play both at home and abroad in terms of some of the challenges we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. But we want to comment on the mitigation thing as well, because I think you're right. I mean, it's been shown again and again and again that preventing is actually less costly than responding and recovering. I've always, this has been the debate, right? Because people can't, it's hard to sell, oh, we helped people that you can't see, right? It goes somehow against the business model in so much of our policy world. So it's interesting, but I do think we have to stop disasters in any way we can. And that's where that mitigation comes in. It's whatever you want to call it, climate justice, climate programming, infrastructure. There's so many ways we can be mitigating disasters, addressing social inequities, because the disaster is only a disaster when it's the hazard meets the vulnerability. And so we can work on both sides of that. And we need to figure out how to work on both sides of that. So just really want to highlight that there are people may be doing more in mitigation than they think they are, because they think of mitigation as somehow this disaster risk reduction world, but it's actually so much broader than that. And if they just kind of open their minds to that, we may get a lot further at helping communities than we think, because we're too stuck in what we believe it is. But Colin, I really appreciate the question. And so a couple of things I think philanthropy can do. I mean, one is we can and we should be innovative. We need to draw our programmatic priorities from communities themselves, really listen to them, their needs, and the solutions, creating solutions that and design that devolves the power to the very people affected, allowing them to have agency over the solutions and dignity within their recovery. I mean, we've heard a lot of this over the past year, especially, but it cannot be said enough. We have to do this. Communities are best served when philanthropic dollars complement government ones, not replace them. I spoke recently to HUD at their annual meeting, and one of the challenges I put to them is, why do you ask philanthropy to pay to have communities understand your systems like that? Wouldn't it be better if your systems were easier to understand and we could put the money somewhere else? I mean, all of that is within the realm of the possibility we need to try and bring forward. Additionally, philanthropy, we need to program our funds quickly. It's one of the beauties of philanthropy. We will always be faster than the government. So it's not as, and I don't mean quickly as in the immediate days after a disaster. I'm not taken back from the fact that recovery is, still more valuable for those communities than response. But there's a need for a balance of that. But streamlining, your giving through trust-based grant-making processes that focus on the long tail of recovery, that recognize, again, what the community needs and what they're asking for. And lastly, philanthropy needs to provide unrestricted multi-year support. If we trust community nonprofits to implement programming, we need to trust them to understand the fluidity of the recovery needs, and we need to give them the ability to navigate emerging challenges and to adapt. we need to fund them to be sustainable partners for the people, they serve. And so those are just some of the things I think philanthropy can move forward on. There's been some different commitments to that. My hope is that it doesn't go post-COVID. Everybody suddenly goes back to the way that used to be because it's comfortable and they missed it, but actually continues to grow and develop and advance in the ways that we have already during this pandemic. At this point, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions from the Q&A from the audience, or even Supriya and Colin for each other. And then I'll pause a minute and see if there's questions. Supriya, I'm going to start us off with a question for you, actually, because as I said, I recently spoke with HUD and I had looked at all the various state of disaster philanthropies to get information to bring to them. And I'm just curious, like, what's your, having looked at this data so clearly, understanding why are there these enormous fluctuations in giving? Like, why would they drop from 9 billion to 1 billion in 1 year? Why isn't there more of a consistency? It's not like their disasters stopped happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think one can only speculate, but in general, we did see that 2019 was a slower year comparatively in terms of the big names disasters. We didn't see as many as we'd seen just prior in 2018. So that could be part of it. There, when there's fewer disasters with the big names, there's fewer media coverage. So, that sometimes we do see these sort of trends of when it comes to philanthropy, the bigger names, the bigger years often do mean bigger funds. It is a bit tricky with HUD because they are, they were responding to prior years. So I'm not entirely sure why there was such a big gap. And it was surprising to see such a big decrease in funding, given what had happened the prior year.
One thing, Patty, just to also respond to that we often note is that it's so difficult to identify an upward trend in disaster spending because it is so spiky, because to Supriya's point, big events happen in certain years. Then Congress responds maybe a year later, along with other disasters, to pass a big supplemental bill. So you have a lot of spending in that fiscal year. So it can be really challenging that way in terms of identifying those trends over time.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess it also depends a little bit on it's harder. That gets into a granularity of, is it certain states that are able to fight more for funding for their areas, et cetera. So watch the space. Maybe that'll be where we start to go with greater in-depth reporting. Supriya, there's another question related to the data, and it's about whether our FEMA figures include both public and individual assistance programming.
Yes. The short answer is yes, it does include both. And we also include hazard mitigation as well as funding that goes to fire prevention. So we do include all the data sets that we can get from FEMA that are disaster related. We do not include any funding that goes to weapons or, terrorist related funding. So we do stick to just natural disasters and humanitarian crises.
Great. There's another question in here about localization. As we know, this is a big topic, and especially on the international side. And one question is, how do you connect localization within the framework of preventing, mitigating, and responding? What are some suggestions you may have on that, or evidence you've seen?
Is that for me or Colin?
Well, I mean, I'm just opening it up to anyone. I can take a stab at it as well from the international side if you'd like. So, I mean, definitely localization is a huge. It's already underfunded for its response and recovery frame. So the concept of working on preventing, mitigating, responding. I mean, one of the challenges on the international side is such a bifurcation of the disaster versus the development, funding, and so much of this becomes who is the experts to do this appropriately. And I don't mean by this the local or the international, I mean, what funding agency is responsible? And so it's a little, unfortunately, like a hot potato. Is it the development actors who have the greater responsibility in that mitigation, in that prevention activities, or is it the disaster experts who are there, not in every country, are there for usually very specific rationales, and maybe it's almost too late if they're on the ground for the mitigation phase to begin. So those are challenges, I think, from the international side that the systems get in the way, the mandates get in the way, the funding streams get in the way of some of that. And localization is just but one of the many complexities that prove a challenge to success in that space. I think it's probably slightly easier on the domestic side, merely because the agencies aren't quite as divided, though, of course, as Colin said, there's so many different agencies and who's doing what, but I leave it to one of them. If they have a response on that, if we're not sure, we can just progress on, because we don't, I can't speak to the local area as well, domestic as well. I don't know, Colin, if you have any thoughts on something. No. So we can move on to the next, another question, which is, sorry, I was just here. Supriya, do you have a sense that the IRS delays are here to stay? And do you think that the delays will shrink over time, or they get caught up again?
Yes, that's a good question. We actually, since the release of the report, we have seen an increase and a flux of IRS forms coming in. So that's a good sign. And we're seeing, more flow through towards, hopefully before the end of the year, we'll have a complete or close to complete 2019 data set. So I do think that things are looking better, and hopefully we're already catching up, and then next year should hopefully not have any more delays. But it all also depends on what happens with the pandemic, what systems are put in pressure next year as we continue to get out of the pandemic.
Okay, and Colin, here's a question for you. How can community nonprofits better shape our request to the philanthropic groups to make preparedness and mitigation efforts more acceptable and interesting to fund instead of just response and recovery? I'm hoping that you can answer that in terms of your collaboration with the state agencies and the federal and tracking them. What are some of the things that nonprofits can do?
It's a little outside of my lane, but I think that it boils down to showing that the return on investment is there. That it can be a little hard to drill that down in a very local way, because a lot of the data we have to show that return on investment is quite meta in a way. So that figure that I talked about, a $6 return for every dollar invested, that's nationwide. We have done some research to break that down to the state level. That still showed that the vast majority of states had a return on investment of 6%, or sorry, $6 or more. But I think showing that there is consensus in the research about the value of these mitigation projects is really critical.
Right. And I definitely just want to highlight, as well as what I had said earlier, Colin, related to that, which is philanthropy. If philanthropy is responsive to listening to communities, if we can get philanthropy to shift itself, then nonprofits should be able to fit within that model. And so I think, look at who signed on to the Council of Foundations, pledge about, making funding more available, doing multi-year, being more community driven, looking for localized solutions, and challenge them to hold up their, I know that I'm sure I can hear the nonprofit already saying, wait, but there's power politics in that, but you can do it politely. You can highlight that. You can say that evidence is proven that working with communities, allowing communities to resolve their solutions, to find their solutions, you will help them mitigate. You will help them, explore what those activities are. Even at the early days of COVID, you had a lot of people saying, well, this is now just a space for the disaster organizations. Everyone else has to step back. But I don't know about you, but it was the arts that kind of got me through the first year, right? The comedians on social media. And so there is a question of where we need to challenge that myth of somehow we live in a siloed world and that individuals are one issue resolves it. If you bring me education, I'm happy. No, people are multifaceted. The solutions are multifaceted. The funding has to be multifaceted. And I think that's the challenge to nonprofits, to philanthropy, to bilateral donors. We need to advance our thinking. We need to advance our narrative. As long as we keep simplifying narratives because we feel that that's what brings in the funding, we are never going to match up with the actual complexities that are on the ground, the reality for the people who are impacted and affected by disasters. And I think that's one of the beauties of the State of Disaster Philanthropy report and the data that Supriya, and her team are able to bring forward is it shows the complexities. It shows that not all the funding goes into one space. And it also shows that not enough funding goes in, period, right? And that may be one of the drivers for the competition of that simple narrative, right? Because if you're the one who can win with the simple narrative, you're the one who can win the funds. And I think we all need to kind of join together and just challenge that and break that. And that takes all of us. So I feel, definitely if you're out there, as I made the appeal in the beginning, challenge for more funding, challenge for data reporting, challenge for creativity in what they're willing to fund, and hold philanthropy accountable, hold yourselves accountable, hold the other donors accountable. And that's the way we hopefully will get communities the assistance they need to thrive. I'm just having to take a moment here to look for another question because there's a few coming in. Supriya, how can implementing organizations, this is more of a data question, how can implementing organizations build evidence of impact and visible models of transformation that will, basically help them with some of this evidence they may need, presenting some of this data out on what the requirements are. Just this is, I think, less to do with the disaster report, but more just your expertise of having read through this. What is some of the evidence you think resonates?
Yeah, that's interesting. And especially as we're seeing about, the different life cycle stages of the life cycle of disasters, funding for things like, example, mental health sometimes might not be considered disaster funding, but play a huge part of how funders can think about longer term recoveries for communities. We're going to see a lot of that, especially after COVID, and how different people have had to live with lockdown and the realities of living in this weird world that we're living through. So I think it's also a little bit to what you were speaking about, Patty, is just thinking outside of the box. It is not core disaster funding if you think about it in that way. But if you're thinking largely about how communities are impacted after a disaster, or thinking about it in terms of preparedness too, you might not think about actors like schools, or you might not think about actors like artists, and thinking about how you can fund them to better prepare for disasters. So, thinking about community spaces, I think that's really important, because you might not, again, think about it specifically when you're thinking about funding for disasters, but there are other actors within that space that you can help to build community, and people and organizations that communities turn to during the times of crises. And so improving funding to organizations that people might turn to at a time of crisis, and helping them plan before a disaster strikes, that's a great and effective way to have a strategy in place. Things like that. Those are some of the activities you can do. And I think sometimes it is hard to show outcome, right? So if there's a disaster that does not happen, it's hard to say, well, we had this plan, we never used it. But, it does show that, there are ways for communities to get together before, though, and plan, and so that no one's scrambling. And that was something that we saw happen this past year, when everyone was scrambling because they didn't know where to go to. They didn't know who to look to. So creating those plans can be very effective. And I think telling the story of, what comes out of that is a great way to show some impact and measure some of that. It does often happen to be anecdotal, and that's the issue with some of this. It can be very subjective, and trying to find that story is important.
Right. And Colin, what do you think the roles of philanthropy should be in the next few years relating to leveraging federal funds, BRIC or HUD or infrastructure to support local mitigation efforts?
Yeah, I think we're in a really interesting position now of states and local governments being flush with cash opportunities to invest in mitigation. And I think for philanthropies, especially community-based philanthropies, you all know the needs the best. So I mean, being able to point to projects or communities where that funding should be going, and take some of that, I don't want to say burden, but take some of that work off of the state and local agencies that are trying to parse through all of this funding and allocate it, and the policymakers who are also trying to do the same thing. I think is really critical, because in a lot of cases, the philanthropies are the ones who know the communities best and can really direct that type of activity.
And Colin, how easy is it for states to track their disaster spending?
It's a good question. I think one of the things that I pointed out in terms of the challenges was just how spread out it is across the agencies at the state level. Another challenge is one that we've been talking about, that disasters don't necessarily happen in every community every year. So, state policymakers who have not been in office for very long may not have ever had to deal directly with a disaster. So there are certainly some obstacles that need to be overcome in terms of tackling the disparate nature of the spending, and kind of getting that policymaker attention. One thing that we've pushed for is for the effort to be centralized. I think one of the maybe overlooked points of authority on this are state budget offices, since they're the ones who can track the funding and track the spending across all of the agencies involved. A number of states, over a dozen now, I think, are undergoing state resiliency planning, statewide resiliency planning efforts. Another opportunity, right, to pull in all those partners and even potentially pull in all those financials to figure out where exactly is the spending happening. And really, it's to have that high level attention on it, be it from a governor, be it from high-ranking committee member on your state's finance committees, or even from the federal government, to kind of apply that pressure to be able to capture that spending. I think is key.
And just keeping that state community level kind of mindset. I mean, Supriya, what's the role of community foundations? What role do they play in disaster giving? And if you could also maybe touch on institutional funding, like what are the comparisons there? Who gives more?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think Colin, alluded to this a little bit. Community foundations, by nature of where they're situated, are best able often to understand what their community needs. And they're often able to connect the dots a lot quicker. They're on the ground, they know who the actors are. So I think they play a very big role in disaster philanthropy. In terms of who gives more, it really depends year by year. There isn't, one answer. We've seen community foundations come up there at the top as some of our bigger givers. They often are the ones who give more grants, even if they're smaller grants, but they're often, the ones who are giving larger number of grants to smaller actors. So.
And so this is the 2019 report, looking at 2019 data. Next year is as we know going to be, and as you referred to, going to be really blowing our charts off because of COVID and the giving that happened there. So one is like foreshadow for us a little bit. What do you think that's going to look like? But also, some of the comments that have come in have touched on the complexity of some of the giving in COVID, some of it being reimbursable and repaid and match. How are you going to navigate some of those complexities within the giving, or is that like wait and see? We haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, it's what we grappled when we did the first edition of the report that we released this year and the edition prior to that. So it is going to be a big year. We have historically seen institutional philanthropy sort of level in the millions. We have never seen philanthropy go into the billions as it relates to disaster. So already we know it's beyond the charts, right? It'll be interesting to see. There's so many questions to ask, right? One is, how do we collect this data? We've already started to think through not just separating the pledges from the grants, right? So we can actually see, okay, where were the dollars actually sent and where were the dollars promised? And now can we see were those promised dollars actually received? Because that's a big question too. A lot of funders often, when a disaster happens, they're quick to pledge the money. Then we don't actually know if the money went through and followed through. So that will be a big question we'll have to ask and try and track those dollars. And we also will want to see, how did other disaster funding get impacted? It's not like other disasters were on hold in 2020. We had other disasters going on at the same time. And can we see, did anything happen because everyone was focused on COVID? Or did every other disaster stay relatively the same in terms of giving? So these are just some of the questions we're going to have to tackle next year. And I think, just in general, a big challenge is there was a lot of general operating support, which is a good thing. We want general operating support. But now what we're seeing is, when funding data comes to us, we have to be clear to see, what was general operating support that was given because of COVID, as opposed to just general operating support. And so that'll be a challenge for us next year, is to properly and accurately allocate what was giving that we can identify as COVID as opposed to general operating support, even if that was increased general operating support because of COVID. So it'll be a lot of, and this is where funders can help us, right? If you provide us with descriptions, and if you are clear on your IRS forms of where this giving is going, we understand that funders don't think about their IRS forms as places where they want to add detail. But the reality is that's where we get a lot of the details. So, if it's not clearly identified as COVID funding, we are not going to know, and we will not include it in the data set. And so that really does not give us the most transparent picture of what's actually happening.
Right. So and give as much detail as you can in the forms that you're filling in, right? So I think
Exactly.
That means a connectivity, obviously, between your program staff and your financial staff who are submitting those
Exactly.
reports. So,
or better still, share your data directly with us. Then you don't have to worry about
exactly,
that. So,
exactly. So I'm not sure, Colin, if you have an answer to this, but how do federal funding decision makers take into account an NGO's private funding when they're applying for federal grants? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's a good question that I could dig into, but I think if we're thinking of FEMA awarding a public assistance grant, not exactly sure how that all fits together, but
yeah. I mean, I think definitely, my understanding is if they do have some co-funding, it's going to show a match that makes them more attractive. I think that's unfortunately, a general formula is money brings money in terms of this, in terms of confidence and trust. But I think that you'd have to look at the exact requirements of any funding request, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and I would also just add that the original question that went to Supriya was about COVID-19 funding having a lot of cost share requirements and being reimbursement based. And I think it's important to an important reminder that that's the case for a lot of federal disaster funding as well, right? Like that's the status quo for public assistance, is that states and in some cases locals and in some cases nonprofits are trying to come up with that generally 25% cost share that they're required to cover. So it's a challenge that we have faced as well in trying to account for state spending, figuring out yes, states have to expend this money, but it's partially reimbursed. So how do you track that over fiscal years and that sort of complexity?
And I think it ties a bit to the challenge, we've put forward. And I think one of the things hopefully we've shown everyone on this webinar is there are no solid answers to anything. There's so many complexities. And that's what we've been really trying to bring out is, everyone's experiences are different. And our challenge is to try and call for simplification, to call for collaboration, to call for connectivity. It will make our data easier. It will make the picture easier to see. It will make everything simpler. And so I think that's really, a big message we want to take forward, because even the matching funds required of communities with FEMA, there's been lots of evidence demonstrating that itself causes challenges. And so why are we saying that we're, focused on bringing up, addressing social inequities, but then requiring all of these systems and structures and that actually further it, and that there's evidence that it furthers it. So I feel, there's definitely a large amount here. The data, there's so much that the State of Disaster Philanthropy can do, I think, to really help us push that conversation. But it's also your own experiences, your own activities, your own, responses and recovery activities that you need to bring that experience in and look at how to improve. So in order to respect everyone's time and keep this to an hour, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. I want to remind everyone that the report and the accompanying tools can be found at disasterphilanthropy.candid.org. I saw a few questions about whether this would be recorded. Yes, it will be available. Thank you to Supriya and to Colin for their words today. Thank you again to our partners at Candid, our co-sponsors, Giving Compass, Interaction, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, Philanthropy California, Philanthropy New York, and the Funders Network. Big thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today. We also want to extend our special thanks to the staff at Candid for their partnership in this important work, and to the team at CDP who have worked so hard to make this report a reality. If you have any questions, and I think there are lots, if the comments is anything to go by, that were not addressed during today's call, you may email them to Tanya.Gulliver-Garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Her information is also on our website. Thank you and have a great afternoon.